right. Um, okay. Well, I think we'll get started. So I'm so glad everybody was able to take some time out of their Shabbat afternoon, out of perhaps I don't know, a walk or a nap. I may have had a nap, but anyway, whatever it is that brings you joy on your Shabbat afternoon, I'm glad that you left some room for learning and for study. And we have a really special program planned, and I would like to introduce our guest teacher and also my rabbi and friend, Michael Adam Latz. I'm going to just say a little bit about him. Nothing embarrassing, Michael. Don't worry. Um, but Rabbi
The
Latz
list of my embarrassing stuff is
is
far bigger than yours, Rabbi. So
Indeed. So Rabbi Latz has been at Congregation Shir Tikvah in Minneapolis since 2009. I was there when he arrived, and it was quite a fanfare, and it's been an incredible arc of amazing spirituality and amazing Torah ever since. Um, he had come to he grew up in Minneapolis, and before he came to Shir Tikva, he was the founding rabbi of Kol HaNeshama in West Seattle, and we have some folks in our community with a connection to that congregation. Um, and more recently, um, Rabbi Latz is a senior rabbinic fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, which means he's engaged in some very deep study of Torah and Jewish texts with very gifted teachers and some amazing rabbis. And I think I have this right in terms of if this is past or present. I believe Michael is a recent past co-chair of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, which is an organization that does very important work. And you know, if you you might get the idea that that this rabbi is a leader in the social justice space, and you would be right. In addition to that, he is an amazing preacher and an amazing teacher, and I'm just so excited that you're with us today, Michael. So Michael has some things to teach us, and I will promise ahead of time that there will be some opportunity for us to ask questions and to engage with the material. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Rabbi.
thank you, Rabbi Bargeron. It is such a joy to be with you. I'm so happy we're here. And I promise you that we will come visit you in person now that we are emerging from this dreadful pandemic. I can't wait. Um, and you have your rabbi is one of my very favorite people in the world. Y'all lucked out and won the lottery. So uh, enjoy. He has a lot of really great stuff to teach, and he also married one of the most amazing men on the planet, John
Truth.
Tam, who I adore and who should be treated with the reverence that he deserves. All right. I put a link in the chat to the text that we're going to be using today. So if you want to pull them up, you're welcome to do that. And if for some reason you can't get them, I'll put them again right now. And I know Samara is online, and she will have them, and you and Rabbi Barjaran can share them out afterwards. If for some reason it's hard to toggle between the screens, I understand. So I want to begin with a story, and then we're going to dive into some text. And you should just know my style is such that I plan 4 or 5 hours worth of material to try and get done in 40 minutes. And so instead of cutting back on the material, I tend to talk really fast. And so just feel free at any point to raise your hand, to go like this, to ask me to repeat. You will not insult me. Well, at least that won't insult me. Okay. And so I'm delighted to be here. Begin with a blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you, God, for enabling us to be free and for giving us the technology so that we can study together, for people in Minneapolis, for people in Fort Wayne and the surrounding area, and for people I understand in Reston, Virginia. As many of you know, and the sentencing came down yesterday for the police officer here in the Twin Cities. Our neighbor, George Floyd, Zichrono Livracha, was murdered 13 months ago. That murder happened 13 blocks from my home. My husband and I were out for a walk that afternoon, and we heard the sirens only a few blocks away, and then later learned what had happened. As a rabbi in the community, I was called forward and spent a great deal of time at what we now call George Floyd Memorial Square, which is 38th and Chicago Avenue here in the heart of Minneapolis. I was invited by clergy colleagues to be there, and as you know, shortly after the murder, a young woman named Darnella Frazier, who was 17 years old, who I want to say videotaped, but it's not videotaped. She recorded on her phone. I keep saying videotaped, and it shows my age. She recorded it. The recording went viral on Facebook, and the protest began. And pretty quickly, the protest turned into an uprising. But what was so stark and what was so challenging last summer is that when I would go to 30th in Chicago and the various protests and marches, I spent most of my time, and remember, we were in the early days of the pandemic, so touching each other, being in close spaces or in close proximity was nerve-wracking. People were wearing masks. We were trying to figure out what to do. But for the first few weeks of this, every time I went, I spent my time caring for people who were weeping and sobbing and upset. And for me, it became quickly indistinguishable being at 30th in Chicago, which is the place where Mr. Floyd had been murdered, from the Jewish cemeteries that I go to when I do funerals. I've been a rabbi now for 21 years. And by my last count, I believe I've officiated at just under 300 funerals and about 700 Shiva services in my career. So I know sacred ground. I know the context for people being upset. I know what grief looks like. And for me, being at 30th Chicago was just an enormous amount of sadness and grief, and people who needed clergy and other folks to comfort and support them. But then when I would get home, I would watch TV or look online, and the contrast between what was shown from people protesting or some folks damaging buildings was in stark contrast to what I was experiencing as very public grief. And it sparked inside of me a question that I've been wrestling with now for the past 13 months. Amidst what I think are some really potent issues of racial justice and policing in America and really thorny, sticky political conversations, I found myself really thinking about public grief and what it looks like to grieve in public spaces. We Jews have rituals we go through. We have a script, if you will. We know about when somebody dies, saying Shema. We have the tearing of our clothes with kriya, or the ribbon. We have the mourning and a hesped, a eulogy. We then sit shiva. We have rituals we go through, and we understand what public grief looks like. But my question that I'm wrestling with, and I want to share with you today, is what happens when public grief doesn't follow the script that we're used to? How do we think about it? How do we translate it? How do we understand it? And I recognize that I'm raising this question against the backdrop of an incredibly politically polarized country right now, which is also simultaneously, I think, our multi-international media companies and social media in particular drive clickbait, and what gets you to click, what releases those, I don't know if it's the dopamine in your brain to click on things, are things that are more sensational, things that have more drama. So me sitting with 3 young Black teenagers on the curb who are sobbing over the death of George Floyd and terrified about what's going to happen to them in their lives doesn't make the press the same way somebody throwing a Molotov cocktail at a building. And I want to say that I'm not discounting, I want to be really clear, I'm not morally evaluating damage to property or to how the uprising unfolded. What I am saying is that story is incomplete. And I'm realizing that I've been studying and thinking about this past year about the danger of a single story. And I'm looking, to use the words of my friend Rabbi Bargeron from the Hartman Institute, to complexify the story a little bit, to add some layers of what's going on. And again, I'm not looking to, I'm not looking for a particular political shtick here. I'm looking to wrestle with, what does public grief look like when it doesn't follow the script that we're used to? So I'd like to begin in your packet. I'm on page 1. You'll see the very famous artistic rendering of George Floyd, of blessed memory, which is right in my neighborhood. That's right here. It's made its way around the world. Side note, anytime any of you can come to Minneapolis, the art that came out of the uprising over the last year has been mind-blowingly just profound. I'm not an artist, visual artist. I don't know much about it. I've been to the Louvre. I like, good stuff, but like, I couldn't teach anything to save my life. And the art that has come out of people's pain has been extraordinary. Okay, could I have a volunteer to read number 1, George Floyd Memorial Square? Just unmute yourself and read, please. I get sick of hearing myself.
In the middle of 38th in Chicago is an oft photographed Black Power first sculpture by artist Jordan Powell Harris. It is circled by an artfully arranged selection of flowers planted by Jay Webb, a gardener and contractor from the neighborhood with whom Austin checks in regularly. These contributions come equally from individual impulse and collective consensus. Austin usually plays the role of facilitator.
Keep going, please.
Got to get to the next page.
Oh.
One might argue that the square itself is a communal artwork. Running south on Chicago is a piece called The Morning Passage, painted on the street by an artist named Marie Mansfield, listing the names of 168 BIPOC individuals killed by police. In a grassy dell just west of this work is the Say Their Names Memorial, filled with cardboard headstones honoring the lives of 100 Black people lost to white supremacy, from Emmett Till to Breonna Taylor.
Thank you so much, Marcia. I'm Michael. Nice to meet you. I love people who step into the breach. So you'll see the photo there. That is what is in the middle of the square. And I think, to somebody who doesn't know the story, you can tell there's a memorial there, but a lot of folks have focused on the politics of this, right? That it's a Black Power symbol, which, by the way, I'm not judging. I actually think that it's quite appropriate. But when you enter the square about a block away, there's a sign right before you get to the sculpture that says, "You are entering sacred ground. Please treat the space accordingly," right? And what emerged at 30th in Chicago are all of these various memorials. And I've been thinking a lot, as somebody who has traveled to Berlin, who's been to Israel many times, and Yad Vashem. My youngest child will read Torah there next year for the first time. And who has been to the US Holocaust Museum and to the Martin Luther King Memorial and to the Slavery Museum of the African American Experience in Slavery in Washington, DC. We have these memorials, so we know a little bit of something about public grief and about the artistic rendering of public grief. And here it's come out of the moment, and it's literally feet away from where Mr. Floyd was murdered. And I raise this because I think, in a society in which the stories of people are not told and not part of the public record, people will do whatever they can to tell those stories, even create them in the middle of an intersection overnight. This helps me, and this leads me to the text that we're going to talk about in a second, which is from the Yom Kippur afternoon text, the story of Jonah. Wow, that dude was complicated, total crank, total misanthrope. Probably needed levels of therapy beyond what most of us could even ever imagine. And yet the text is so exquisite for Yom Kippur afternoon because it poses a really potent question. What is society's obligation to repent for collective wrongdoing, right? So when we have individuals, as we know in Judaism, right, we do tshuva. We turn to somebody who we've wronged, we own what we've done, we apologize, we offer appropriate restitution, and then we make a commitment not to engage in that behavior again. But Jonah poses this really wild question. What happens when it's not just Michael or Ron or Jackie or Marcia or Denny or Meir or me who does something wrong? What happens when all of society does wrong? So I'm going to read the next text, which in my packet, it's at the top of page 3. It's the Jonah text from chapter 3. Could I have a reader for that? And then I promise the rest will be much shorter and quicker. Michael Rush, would you read? Michael, you're muted.
You are muted, my friend. That's one thing I can't do for you. Sorry.
Yeah, now I got to find where I was. Here we are. Can you hear me?
Yep. Thank you.
The word of the Eternal One came to Jonah a second time. Go at once to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim it to what I tell you. Jonah went at once to Nineveh in accordance with God's command. Nineveh was an enormously large city, a 3 days walk across. Jonah started out and made his way into the city, the distance of 1 day's walk, and proclaimed, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. The people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and great and small alike put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his robe, put on sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he had the word cried through Nineveh by decree of the king and his nobles, no person or beast, of flock or herd, shall taste anything. They shall not graze, they shall not drink water. They shall be covered with sackcloth, human and beast, and shall cry mightily to God. Let everyone turn back from their evil ways and from the injustice of which they are guilty.
Okay, Michael, I'm going to pause you for 1 second, right?
Okay.
Just to make sure we're following the thinking here. Remember, God calls out to Jonah, go tell the people of Nineveh they're sinning, they're doing wrong. The first time Jonah's like, I'm not so into this job, I don't want it, I didn't apply for it, leave me alone. Okay, this time around, Jonah seems to believe God, carries the word to the people. And what's their response? How do they respond?
Shall I continue?
1 second, Michael. Ron was going to answer, and then you can
okay.
continue in 1 second, because you're
All
getting
right.
to the good part. I just want to make sure we understand where we are. Ron?
It looks like they're fasting. They're taking some responsibility for their actions and trying to make amends.
At the very least, from the outside, it looks like they're taking this seriously, right? Okay, Michael, bring us home, and this is where it gets really good.
Who knows but that God may turn and relent? God may turn back from divine wrath so that we do not perish. God saw what they did, how they were turning back from their evil ways. God renounced the punishment that God had planned to bring upon them and did not carry it out.
Beautiful. Thank you, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
Appreciate it. So here we have a story. We don't exactly know what the people did wrong. The text isn't explicit. This reminds me a lot of the story of Noah, right at the beginning of Genesis, where there's a little more detail given, where it says that like the earth was full of bad stuff, right? And then God says, I'm going to wipe it out. We don't exactly know here in great detail, but we know it's bad enough that God sends a prophet in to tell them to repent and change their ways. And here something happens. We don't exactly know what, but the collective will is to take it seriously, right? To do what is being asked, to repent as a people, so much so that God notices and pulls back, right? So we don't have a moment like Sodom and Gomorrah here where the entire towns are destroyed. Something happens where the collective action of the people changes God's course. All right, so we learn from the text not all the details, but enough that at least if you listen, according to the Hebrew Bible, you are going to, you know, God will not harm. I want to keep going on this notion of what happens when the collective punishes. In Mishnah, we learn that one who injures another is liable to pay compensation for that injury. So this is about how we do public tshuva, how we offer restitution. And they give 5 categories, which I just think are fascinating. You pay for damages, pain, medical costs, loss of livelihood, and humiliation. Now, the lawyers among us, and if you are lawyers here, I am not going to try and tread on your legal standing. The current board chair at my shul is a judge, and anytime I get anything legal, I very nervously, you know, and very humbly submit that I stick to Talmud. But here in the Mishnah, this notion that if you have done wrong, you must pay damages, but it is not only for property, right? It's for pain, for medical costs, for loss of livelihood, and for humiliation. So what does this have to do with the Jonah text? Well, I think that the linkage between the two is that it's one thing to say that a society that has done wrong must repent. The Mishnah offers us a way in to describe specifically what kind of pain and suffering has occurred and what society's obligation is to those who have been harmed. I'm going to read the next text. Actually, you know what? I think I am going to skip ahead. The text on "There shall be no needy among you" is really interesting. On your own, you should read it. It is a great text to preach from, and it's a great text to study as a community because it's both a directive and an aspiration. Okay, after we have acknowledged that societies can do wrong, not just individuals, the question for us becomes, what about this notion of tshuva, right? We know that individuals are supposed to do tshuva, are supposed to turn and try and repent for wrongdoing. What about society as a whole? And I want to say here, there's a note. Oftentimes, when there's been wrong done by people to other people, we rush to reconciliation. We want healing to happen. But there can't be healing without truth-telling. And there can't be healing without the naming of pain. I'm in an interfaith, I'm in several interfaith clergy groups here in the Twin Cities, and I have a beloved pastor friend. Her name is Rebecca Vocal. She's a dear sister of mine, and she talks. She's a UCC minister. She says that her own people, progressive Christians, spent a long time trying to become reconciling congregations with the Black community. But she said there's a falseness to that story because reconciling assumes that there are two parties who are coming together who've had a falling out. And what, in her mind, actually, Black folks don't have to reconcile with white folks in America. It's white folks in America who have to take responsibility for the harms that we have caused. And then we can start talking about reconciliation. So I've been playing with this idea, and I'm really trying to figure out, like, what wisdom does Judaism have to offer, right? We don't have the same understanding of racism, racial injustice, public safety, policing in America in our ancient sources as we do in 2021. And nonetheless, as a rabbi, I want to see what wisdom can I mine from the tradition to help inform our discussion today, can help us understand this notion of public grief and public accountability. So in Rambam's Mishnah Torah, okay, Rambam, just as a side note, folks know, 13th century, he was a doctor. He decided that he needed to be a rabbi too, went on to write this fascinating and super bizarre book called The Guide for the Perplexed, which actually does not help anybody who is perplexed to actually understand anything. It is only obtuse and super confusing. Rabbi, if you disagree with me, feel free. I took an entire course on it at HUC. I cannot explain any more today. I got an A in the class. I have no earthly clue what the book is about. And my professor, Dr. Lenny Kravitz, it was Thursday mornings at 8 a.m., used to bring in Shlivovitz every morning. And before we studied Rambam, we had to take a shot. I am not a drinker, and drinking at 8 a.m. is not my idea of a good time, but he was very happy with the text. All right, so Rambam writes about tshuva in a really fascinating note in his Mishnah Torah. And he says, it's praiseworthy for a penitent to confess in public, and this is the part that I think is really earth-shattering, to publicize their sins to others, revealing transgressions committed against them. One should tell them, even though I sinned against such and such person by committing such and such deeds, I now repent and express my regret. If a person conceals their sins because of pride and does not reveal them, they will not be able to achieve a complete tshuva, as we learn in Proverbs, Mishlei, one who conceals their sins will not succeed. I have to say, when I found this text, it literally, like, do you ever have something where you read and it feels like you get a headache because your brain is pushing against your skull, and it feels like it's mind expanding? How radical and countercultural is this, right? To say, instead of denying we've done something or keeping it private, Rambam is suggesting a 180 and saying we should create a culture and a society in which people own what they've done wrong, they share it publicly, and the rationale behind it is not to humiliate them, but to help them be accountable for their own tshuva and their own growth, so that they can do better and grow and not sin anymore. And that we, the collective, are to help them do that. And that keeping secrets and not being out about the things we've done wrong means we are not able to do full tshuva and not be in right relationship with each other and with God. Which, maybe you all have heard this before, and I just got to say, I read this about 6 months ago for the first time, and I still, every time I see it, I feel like my hands shake, and I'm like, okay, Guide for the Perplexed wasn't my thing, but Mishnah Torah and this stuff on tshuva is pretty good. So it turns out there are folks in the Jewish world who actually studied this text long before me. As many of you know, apartheid in South Africa, which was the system that kept blacks and whites separate. It was a white minority government oppressing a majority black government for about 6 decades. Longer than that, but legally it was about 6 decades. It ended with the release of Nelson Mandela, Zichrono Livracha, from prison in 1991. He went on to become the first democratically elected prime minister there in many years. And they launched a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a lot you can read on this. It's fascinating. There are some things about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission which were very powerful, very healing for society. And there are some really robust critiques of it and failures in which it did not work and did not demand accountability. I don't honestly know enough to adjudicate the rightness or wrongness, but in my studying, I came across Rabbi Cyril Harris, who testified before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in November of 1999. And this, to me, is one of the most powerful texts and speeches by a rabbi that I have ever come across. I included the link there so you can go to it on your own. But I think, Ron, you were willing to read before. Would you read this text by Rabbi Harris? And I want folks to really hear what he has to say, because it is, wow.
Yes, many worked hard to achieve what they now have and employed much natural ability to do it. But can we really say that all of us would be what we are today in the Jewish community if apartheid had never existed? Can any one of us, as a matter of principle, since it is impossible to determine how South African Judaism would have fared without apartheid, declare confidently that we enjoy no skills, capabilities, and possessions which apartheid gave us? We bear responsibility today whatever role we played in the past, however many letters we wrote to the newspapers, however many bursaries we sponsored, however civil we were to our workers or servants, because it is possible, indeed probable, that our personal circumstances are products of apartheid. And if we are responsible for this country's past, we are of course responsible for its future. In that the Jewish community benefited from apartheid, apology must be given to this commission.
I just want to sit with that for a second because it is such a stunning text. The entire speech is quite remarkable. And you all should know this speech was not met without controversy in South Africa in which it was given. I spoke to my own congregation in Minneapolis a few years ago about racial justice. And I said, quite honestly, that I knew that no one in our sanctuary donned a white hood. I said it with confidence and I meant it. And I also wanted to recognize how the rules were different for the people in the sanctuary who were white than they were for our Black and brown and Asian and Native Jews and or non-Jewish loved ones. And to think about what that meant, what the implications were, what our responsibilities are. I didn't actually have a lot of answers, which turns out irritates a few folks. Rabbis, come on, you should tell us what to do. And I didn't know, and I'm still working on knowing what that means, what that responsibility looks like. But I found Rabbi Harris's text, and I have to say, I have woken up in the middle of the night thinking about this line that he said, and that is, if we are responsible for this country's past, we are, of course, responsible for its future. And I think a lot about this notion of public grief, of public tshuva, of owning up to what we have done wrong, so together we can build a different future. I was part of a panel shortly before COVID hit. The conservative, and I don't mean political, although sometimes political, but the religiously conservative folks in my state love to invite me to come be on panels with them. I think they find me entertaining. I'm not sure, and perhaps not threatening, in part because I so deeply revere and respect their traditions, even as I may disagree with some of the conclusions they come to in public life. And I was on a panel with a pastor who he and I, well, we agree on the fact that we both like toasted sesame seed bagels with lox, and I think that is the only thing we agree on in the earth. And I talked about not that we should walk around, those of us who are white, with shame or humiliation or embarrassment, but to simply recognize that the system has real ruptures in it. It has real pain, especially for our sisters and brothers of color, and not to undo the past, but to name the harms that were done, so together we could build the future. And there's this amazing picture of this very sweet pastor who thinks I am wrong about everything, looking very sweetly at me, just shaking his head like I must be from another planet. His health has not been well lately, and I wish him well. But I think it's one of these moments where we cannot undo our past. We cannot change it. Tshuva is actually never about the past, and that's where I think we get it wrong. Tshuva isn't about the past. Tshuva is taking responsibility for our behavior, so together we can make a different future. And that's why I find Rabbi Harris's words here so breathtakingly beautiful and hopeful. I want to recognize the time and go into the next section, which is a conversation which I have been thinking about now for the past few years, but has really come into the forefront of my thinking as I've been thinking about public grief and about repair and repairing society, doing real tikkun work. And this notion that has emerged in the last several years, well, it's been around for a long time, but I think we in the Jewish community are just starting to talk about it, at least as far as former slaves and Native Americans here in America, talking about reparations as a response to public grief and moral injustice. And the fun thing is that when you are an intellectually and morally curious person, is that you don't have preconceived notions of where you're going to end up. So I found myself from Rabbi Cyril Harris moving back to the book of Exodus. I imagine, by a show of hands, although some of you aren't online, or on screen, which is okay, but most of you have had a Passover Seder, right? Most of you have told the story and read the book of Exodus over and over again. 10 plagues. Pharaoh finally relented to let us go. We threw the dough on our backs. We decided to flee in the middle of the night. We put the, sheep's blood on the door to keep away the angel of death. And we marched through the sea and sang, and Miriam and her timbrel. And okay, great. There's a few lines in there that I had somehow read dozens of times in my rabbinic life and never paid attention to. And then lo and behold, I did. Rabbi, would you read for us, you don't have to do the Hebrew, I won't put you on the spot, but the English of Exodus 12:29 through 36. And I want you to pay close attention to the part that I put at the bottom, folks, in the italics. I think that this is just like, again, I apparently was asleep at the wheel. I missed this in class, and this just blew my mind. Okay, Rav.
In the middle of the night, the Eternal One struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night with all his courtiers and all Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt. For there was no house where there was not someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go, worship the Eternal, as you said. Take also your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone, and may you bring a blessing upon me also." The Egyptians urged the people on, impatient to have them leave the country, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. The Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing. And God had disposed of the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request. Thus, they stripped the Egyptians.
Thanks, Rabbi. It's that last, those last verses that shocked me. I had never noticed them before, which of course I should have noticed, because the whole thing about the golden calf, the Egel HaZahav, is how they build the golden calf, is that they took jewelry out of Egypt. I never thought really hard about like, oh, they took some jewelry. All right. Like, it never occurred to me, but our actual Torah says clearly, both in the Hebrew and in the English, that effectively we ransacked the Egyptians before we left. And Chizkuni, one of the preeminent scholars of the biblical commentators of the Middle East, says that the spoils that we took were the Egyptians paying wages for the enslavement of crushing labor, and that it was owed to us. That 400 years of not being paid for servitude, we took fairly. Now, I don't quite know what to do with this, but embedded in the core narrative of the Jewish people, we were slaved, we cried out, God heard us, and then we left. We took the spoils and we marched out. We received reparations, and it's not the only time in Jewish history that Jews have been on the receiving end of reparations. Anybody know the other time, a little more recently? It's a real question. You can unmute if you like. Samara?
Was working on it, sorry. Was it something, because I don't know, I'm guessing, did it have something to do with the Holocaust?
It did. It did. So as part of the agreement to end World War II and the Shoah, Germany agreed to provide reparations to the young state of Israel. And by the way, if you ever want to go back and learn some really interesting history, there was a great debate in the Knesset about whether or not they should take the reparations or not. David Ben-Gurion of blessed memory, the founding prime minister, was pretty skeptical. And he ended up going along with it because he said, there's more that I've got to do as a prime minister. I got to take, like, whatever, I don't want to have this fight. I've got 19 other fights on my hands in order to establish a state, the least of which is the fact that the Lebanese and the Egyptians are shelling me, right? And so we got reparations. I knew nothing about that until the first time I went to Israel in 1988 as a high school student. And I took a taxi cab in Israel. Anybody remember? Now they're all solar powered Prius, whatever, like good earth cars. I can't think of what's to call, like, you know, like
Green.
huh?
Green.
Green. Thank you. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Green. But back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, what brand were all the taxis in Israel? My husband's here. He's yelling out Mercedes. Right. I had no idea. Why were they all Mercedes? And by the way, I had never been as a 17-year-old in my whole life in a Mercedes. So I thought that, like, this was the coolest thing ever. Why were they Mercedes? Because all the Mercedes were given as part of reparations from Germany for World War II. Right? Today, in fact, there are these commissions, if you yourself are a survivor or you are the descendant of a survivor, where you can apply both for either to get your property back or my in-laws who fled Germany in 1939 when they were babies. My mother-in-law was 7 months old. My father-in-law was about 3. They both were brought by their home cities of Germany back there in the 1990s for a free trip to see their home. And they were invited to apply for EU citizenship, which applies to my spouse and their descendants to get citizenship as part of their effort of reparations. I share this not because I think that the conversation about reparations for whether it's in South Africa for apartheid or for former slaves for Black people in America are exactly the same. But I do share it because there is a very clear textual basis of reparations in Torah and in our own recent history as Jews that we should be sensitive to as we engage in this discussion. Yes, Ron.
Rob, I just want to mention my mother and my uncle who fled from what was then Yugoslavia to this day still receive a check for the property that my grandparents own there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really, where in Yugoslavia were they from, Ron?
Travnik.
Okay. That's really remarkable. If you go to the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C., you can read a lot about the various communities and how they've decided these commissions. It has not been without controversy. And there's a really interesting moral question, right? Of like, what actually gets repaired with reparations? There is a very practical thing, right? There are a lot of survivors of the Shoah who are indigent and who need that money to survive, right? But it does present, you know, you don't just get to write a check and get off the hook. To be fair, while Germany has not been perfect, no country ever could be, the fact that they have compulsory Holocaust education in their schools that every student has to go through, the fact that they have banned far-right parties from the government, although as we've seen around the world, there has been a resurgence of people. And by the way, when I say far-right, I'm not talking about garden variety Democrats, Republicans. I'm talking about right-wing extremists who believe the world is flat, that there's a Jewish conspiracy to take over, and who are trying to march again in the streets. And by the way, that those parties are finding their way in the U.S., in Germany, in Turkey, and in Israel. There's a Kahanist party there that is equally part of this far right-wing resurgence. But in Israel, in Germany, those parties are illegal. All right, so I want to pose this question to us as Jews as we think about, in our last few minutes, this notion of public grief, of reparations, of how do we respond to the grief? What is our collective responsibility when society has done people wrong? My very dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Shir Brous, gave a drash a few years ago that is not only quite popular and quite well written, she is brilliant and an incredible textualist, knowing her way through Torah and Talmud better than most. So she gave this speech on the call for a national reckoning. And I'm just going to read it, and then we can spend a minute discussing. And I gave you the link both to this drash, which you can look at if you like, or watch, as well as Aryeh Bernstein below. So she writes, in Talmud Gittin, there is a dispute among rabbis. And by the way, that is not unusual. The rabbis didn't have iPhones, so all they could do was argue with each other, which they perfected into an art form. What ought we do if a house, and by the way, I say this, I read this text, and it takes on new meaning today, given what happened in Miami, literally with the house collapsing and those people who have died. We don't know the numbers yet, but the official count as of an hour ago, I think, was 5, but it looks like it is going to be staggeringly more. So I just sensitively, I read that with this echoing in my ears, and I think of all those people, may their memory be for a blessing, and all those who are hurt and their loved ones whose hearts are broken. I don't want to be insensitive as we read this text about a beam. There's a dispute among these rabbis. What ought we do? Maybe even if a beautiful palace is built on the foundation of a marish hagazul, a stolen beam. Turns out the way they made ancient buildings were, mostly A-frames, and the beam that runs across, I'm not an architect and don't play one on TV, but the beam that runs across literally held the structure up. So without it, the building would collapse. So what happens if even we have a beautiful palace that's built upon a marish hagazul, a stolen beam? Shammai, who is somewhat of a curmudgeon, argued, you got to tear it down in order to retrieve the beam and return it to its rightful owner. Property rights were big for Torah, but even bigger for the Talmudic rabbis. And ownership rights, property rights mattered. So Shammai was a literalist. My guess is that he and Justice Scalia would have been very close buddies. For him, it was simple. The beam was stolen. If you had to take apart the house in order to return the beam to its rightful owner, that was the right thing to do. It was simple. You can't, as he writes, you can't build something beautiful on a lie. But Hillel, who probably would dance with Justice Kagan, if not Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Zichrona Livracha, Hillel was a little bit more progressive. And he said, what sense does it make to demolish a palace? Let the thief pay for the beam, considering its full value as the foundation of a beautiful home. Now, here's what I find so interesting. So Shammai wrecked the house. You got to give the beam back to the rightful owner. Hillel, you should pay damages, figure out the value plus interest, and pay it back to the person who it was stolen from. But what I find most interesting here is not their debate, is the fact that both of them understood this was an injury, and that both of them understood something had to be done to rectify the injury and to ensure that justice was done. Rabbi Brous goes on, and you can read here by Aryeh Bernstein as well, to argue that our nation was built on a marish hagazul, on a stolen beam, on the stolen labor of Black slaves, and that in order to make it right, we as a society need to think about what reparations would look like for the descendants of Black slaves and people who were brought over here against their will. It's a conversation more and more members of the Jewish community are starting to emerge into. I have no idea what it will look like. I'm seeing some really interesting proposals out there on everything from one of the ways that we create generational wealth in America is by being able to pass down homes, home ownership, and education. That if you can prove that you are the descendant of a slave, you should get to go to college for 4 years for free, and that you should get an interest-free home loan to begin to build up generational wealth. I am not an economist. I'm a rabbi. And so I don't know how much that would cost. I don't know what it would be. I think it's an idea that we should at least be engaged in talking about, not because we can eradicate the sins of the past, or that even any of us were alive and were responsible, but we are benefiting, as Rabbi Harris noted, from a society that was built. And I recognize too, that whiteness, Jewishness, Jews of color is a really multi-layered, complex question that we cannot resolve in this 1 hour discussion. And I don't pretend to. But I do think that we can be strong enough and courageous enough and loving enough to enter into a discussion and to listen deeply, to try and take the expressions of public grief that are there in George Floyd Square, which are about one man and about, as we know, so much more, and begin to repair the foundation of a society that is fractured and broken, and build for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, a very different future for all of them and for all of us. We haven't ever done it before, so we don't know what it will look like. But I'm hopeful it might look a little bit better than the past, and treat each person in our society with just a little bit more love and dignity and justice than they have right now. I am happy to entertain questions or comments in our last 5 minutes together. Yes, Ron or Marcia, I'm not sure.
One of the statements you made earlier that I thought was a really beautiful and poignant argument for critical race theory that has taken hold. So the question I would ask is, what do you find would be the strongest argument to pose against those people that, especially I'm thinking of legislatures around the country, that are banning the teaching of critical race theory. So what would you think would be the strongest argument, persuasive argument against those perspectives?
Right. So 2 things. One is, anytime we try and ban a discussion or a conversation, first of all, I feel like it goes against our Constitution and the First Amendment, which just seems like a bad idea. I happen to be a person who is very enamored with the notion of more speech, not less, though I think we should listen more. But I don't think we actually solve critical societal problems by shutting down conversations. So that's one general argument, Ron. The second argument I would make is, and it's mostly a pastoral question, and I'm perplexed by a notion that we would squash a theory, right? So I guess my questions would be, what are people afraid of? No one that I know who espouses critical race theory, or that we as a collective society need to take responsibility for harms of the past, say that it's the only theory. And that's not what theories do, right? A theory is a set of ideas and hypotheses that we're putting forth to engage in a discussion in pursuit of trying to find a greater truth. My hunch, Ron, is that there are multiple conversations happening at the same time. My guess is that there are some people who are very legitimately and honestly and sincerely skeptical. And for those folks, I'd really like to be in dialogue with them. And then I think that there are some pretty craven political leaders who are using this as the latest wedge issue to distract and deflect from taking responsibility, from making hard decisions about how society should both raise and spend its resources, and decisions we should around everything from COVID to infrastructure to addressing climate to how neighbors care for each other. So I'm not sure I answered your question in a nice bow, Ron, but I'd love to be part of the discussion, and I will talk, as Meir knows. I am willing to talk and listen to anybody and listen to anyone. And
I have a question for you.
sure.
I am and have been for many years concerned about Native Americans. I mean, we came here and we are here in no matter what part of our country we're existing in now because of the expulsion of the Native American.
Yep.
And just as an aside, they were pushed out, they were destroyed, absolutely destroyed, as the Jews were in Germany. And I just feel that the Native Americans have not been given at all the attention by the Jewish community that it should have.
I didn't hear a question there. I heard a statement, and I just want to say I fully agree. And here's what I would say, Susie, and that is whenever anybody tries to pit groups of people who are not part of the majority against each other, I'm always really curious about what their motivation is and what story they're trying to tell. It's true that we are not all the same, and that we have some really important differences. I don't paper over them. I don't brush over them. But I do think that there are a lot of ways we can come together by honoring each other's pain and learning from each other's stories and traditions and being stronger with one another. And we are in a moment where we're all going to have to make some really important active choices about the kind of neighborhood we're going to be building, whether it's our local neighborhood and our physical neighbors or our online neighborhood or the kind of community. And I'll just say, you know, and then I know we have to end in a second, but I saw Marcia and Denny wanted to maybe say something. When Tree of Life happened 3.5 years ago, my phone started ringing off the hook. And the first 7 people who called were Black Christian pastors and Black imams, because they knew. They understood what we were going through, and I had showed up in so many moments of tragedy in their community that we had members of a mosque who came to religious school on Sunday morning, and they surrounded the periphery with members of the local Catholic Church to make sure that we and our kids were safe that morning. And so it was pretty remarkable. And it's not perfect. We have a lot of differences and disagreements in our communities. I don't want to paper over them or pretend they don't exist. But I think that we can build a different world together, but it's going to take a lot of sweat and tears to do it. And like you said, Susie, be courageously out there to say we need to build better relationships with our Native communities. So can I take, Meir, can I take Marcia's question and then wrap it up? Thank you.
We'll be real quick because I want to ask you a question, so you don't have to take that time. But I do, my mind is spinning, and I think I'm going to have lots of questions, so I'm going to do some of the readings. But what I wanted to share was, as soon as you were introduced and we were told that you were the founding rabbi at Kohen Neshama, I sent a text to my son, and I said, "Debbie, do you know who Rabbi Latz is?" And he said, "Well, of course I do." And our son is Orrin Reynolds. And he said, "Not only do I know him, but I got to work with him for a virtual service at services because he works at Kohen Neshama." So I just needed to tell you that Orrin sends his best.
Thank you so much. It's so nice, you know, because when you're being ordained from school, you have this notion like, oh, wow, there's like real differences in different synagogues and like this building, this budget, that whatever. And the truth is, wherever you go, there is, in every synagogue, thank God, Marcia, there's always the mother who has to tell you that her kid knows you. And I just want to say, like, it's a universal truth in every synagogue on the planet that, like, before you end, you've got to have that person who lets you know. And I really appreciate it. It makes me feel very at home. Good luck with your son. He's working at a great place, and it's a really special community.
It really is.
Thank you.
Started off a great group.
Yep. I want to thank Samara for the back end running things today, and for Rabbi Barjaran for inviting me to teach. You have an exquisite rabbi who is soulful and smart and deep, and I hope you will help him along in these conversations, because, as you know, we're in a moment where this stuff is complicated and it's really hard, and we're having to navigate all sorts of tricky stuff inside of ourselves, who we are, what we know, what we believe, how we were raised. My dad, we were just filling out, my oldest daughter is applying to college next year, and we were talking about it. And my husband and I are both white. Our daughter is white. And so we checked that box. And my father, who's 75 years old, was taken aback. Jews aren't white. And it wasn't hostile, right? But when he grew up in North Minneapolis, that was unheard of. He couldn't imagine that. And so I don't share that because I think I'm right and my dad is wrong, although on most other things he's right and I'm wrong. And he'll tell you that. But I do think that we are entering a moment where these conversations are really complicated. And what I would bless you with today is to follow the Talmud. God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them proportionately. Try and listen. We are all going to make mistakes in these conversations. And sometimes when we make mistakes, we're going to hurt people we care about. Whether it's a friend, whether it's a member of our congregation, whether it's someone we don't know. And as Jews, we understand that learning is a lifelong process. And so I bless you with keeping open to learn about these really difficult but important and vital conversations, because what you're going to do as you do it is expand the circle of who we're welcoming into the Jewish people and enabling everybody to feel more whole and more loved and more respected. And so if you're somebody like me, you spend a lot of time opening up your mouth to change feet, please practice that I'm sorry muscle, but not just I'm sorry. When you screw up, because you will, apologize, acknowledge, and then ask where you can learn more. And when you're presented with the opportunity the next time, try and not, like me, say the dumb thing, and then learn and grow together so we can be stronger with each other. All right, thanks, Rabbi. I went over. I apologize.
It's a gift. Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us today, and for this really powerful teaching, and for being a vehicle for our tradition to us, and to help us see it perhaps in new and different ways, and to maybe push on our skulls a little bit, like you described. So thank you very much, Michael. Thank you everyone for coming here, and we will have another special learning opportunity tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Time with Rabbi Devorah Weisberg, she's like totally blow your mind teacher, who will be talking about what is Reformed Jewish identity anyway, and examining two paths that led us to the same place between the Reform and the Conservative movement in terms of returning or bringing the matriarchs to the Amidah. So it'll be a very interesting discussion. I look forward to seeing you at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you again, Rabbi Latz. Have a beautiful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, rabbis.
Thank you everyone for coming. Hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank
Shabbat
you.
shalom, everyone.
Yeah.
Shabbat shalom.